Okay, so I'm going to be talking about The Viking, which is a Hollywood film from 1928, directed by the Irish director Roy William Neill. I'm going to be looking at the pagan religious themes, how they're presented in the film. So, first, an overview of the movie. It's loosely based on the several medieval accounts that we have of Leif Erikson's life, namely the saga of the Greenlanders, Eric the Red saga, and Heimskringla. And the events of the film and the literary sources take place around the turn of the first millennium. The film does not stick very closely to the source material. I mean, the main character is made up for the movie. It's this guy right here. So his name is Duke Alwyn of Northumbria, and in the first scene of the movie, he's hanging out at his castle in England. He gets attacked by Vikings and turned into a slave. And he ends up as Leif Erikson's slave and has to tag along with him as he continues about the events of the sagas. Also, there's a new love interest, Helga Nilsson. She's described as the daughter of one of Leif Erikson's friends, and she's also, for some reason, tagging along with him on all of his adventures. And the movie is pretty heavily Christianity conversion focused, so there's several interesting things for us to look at there as far as the paganism is concerned. So the thing with this movie is it came out right at the tail end of the silent film era. So it's not technically a silent film because it has a soundtrack. It does not have dialogue, and every piece of important information appears through a black screen with text that looks like this. This is the very first one. And they stay on screen for a really long time, makes it extremely difficult to watch. But don't worry, I watched the whole thing, so you don't have to. And yeah, so we can see this is Leif Erikson. That's Alwyn, the slave. You can tell the costumes are super accurate, so that was great. The movie wasn't extremely popular when it came out, and it was a co-production kind of between Technicolor, because it was the first Technicolor 3 movie, and MGM Studios, and the president of Technicolor said that the two problems with the movie were the fact that it came out after people figured out how to put sound in movies, but there was still no talking. So audiences naturally hated that. And there was too much facial hair because apparently people in the 1920s wanted their heroes to be clean-shaven. And, I mean, Alwyn was, but, I mean, look at that mustache. So, yeah, so it wasn't like super famous, and shortly after movies with voices appeared, it completely disappeared from the public consciousness. So, let's look at a little bit of the themes of paganism. So, paganism is kind of the main antagonist of the film. It's more or less the reason that any conflict exists. And the film is very clear that it's the fault of the paganism and not the Christianity. So one of the central conflicts is Leif Erikson's relationship with his dad, Eric the Red, which of course is a religious dimension, which we will see does appear in the source material as well. Paganism is presented very clearly as not just an opposite, almost like a dark mirror image of Christianity in the film. And it's primarily illustrated through violence and intolerance. We can see here this is Eric the Red. He is played by a Danish actor, and he is, I think, in this scene screaming at Leif Erikson when he finds out that his son has become Christian. So, I think there is about 4 very interesting things that we can talk about in terms of the presentation of Norse paganism in this movie. The first one is a statue of Thor. Now, Wow, that's a horrible, horrible picture. You can't see on my screen, you can, but this is a red-skinned man with devil horns clutching some lightning bolts. It's supposed to be Thor, but it really does look like the Christian devil. And you can see here, this is one of Eric the Red's lines of dialogue in his first scene. He's supposed to be dispensing justice to two of his peons that are having a little argument. And he commands them to bow to the great god Thor and give thanks that I have not slain you for drawing knives before the seat of justice. So you can see he's referring to himself as the seat of justice, but also threatening to kill people for displaying weaponry in front of Thor. There's a couple interesting things in terms of like his behavior around the statue. Actually, before he yells at these people, he walks up to the statue, he raises his drink in a toast, and then he pours a little bit on the ground. And then he makes everybody in his hall bow. And I'm not getting too much into the presentation of Christianity in the film because that's a whole other thing, but basically this entire scene with the statue of Thor is a complete mirror of one of the opening scenes in the movie in the hall of Olaf Tryggvason, where he does pretty much the same thing but with a Catholic priest instead of a statue of Thor. And so we're kind of presented with the duality where the same things are kind of happening, but in the pagan hall, there's the violence behind everything, the threat of being killed for seemingly no reason, whereas in the Christian hall, everybody kisses the priest and then there's a big party, and Christianity's dope. And as for how realistic is this idea of the statue of Thor, basically, in terms of archaeology, we can't really say that this giant red-skinned lightning bolt statue was real. We have tiny little things like these that are just a few centimeters tall, and these two statuettes have, by different people at different times, supposedly been attributed to Thor. Definitely the one on the right more so, because it looks like he's clutching his hammer. This one is, as far as I know, only been attributed to Thor by one person, but still, nothing big. This statue in the movie, I think, was about 3 meters tall, so we definitely don't have anything like that. What we do have in the written sources, specifically the Heimskringla, is a scene in which Olaf Tryggvason is said to have destroyed a statue of Thor in a pagan temple. The text says that Thor was adorned with gold and silver rather than red skin, devil horns, and lightning. But still, there's at least this this later medieval idea that there were devotional or religious statues of Thor in pagan temples. So we can say that whether it's a coincidence or not, the creators of the film were somewhat maybe acting in the interest of presenting real history when they included this statue. The appearance, I have to say, it looks a little bit too much like the devil to be a coincidence, especially considering the fact that people do end up getting killed in front of it for no reason. Right after this scene, actually, the two guys that bow down, one of them looks over at the other one, notices he's wearing a crucifix, pulls out the crucifix to the shock of Eric the Red, who immediately runs up and kills him with an axe. So we can see, like I mentioned with the intolerance, there's a zero tolerance policy for Christianity in Eric the Red's hall. Now, comparing that to the sources that we have about Eric the Red and his relationship with Christianity, we can see that it doesn't really seem to have been like this at all. In the two sagas that mention him talking with his son about his conversion, it's said that Eric the Red took coolly to the proposal that he convert, rather than in the film he disowns his son and starts a fight by having his men jump his son's men, and there's a big battle while Leif Erikson has to escape on his ship, refusing to draw his sword because he's Christian. But in the sagas, it just says that Eric the Red took coolly to the proposal. And in fact, his wife converts, has a church built, which he was okay enough with to let the church be built on his land. And then it goes on to say that his wife withheld sex from him until he converted, which he never did, and that it was trying to his temper. So we can see that in the medieval Icelandic source material, Eric the Red was still willing, at least, to have sex with a Christian. So this idea of him jumping out of his chair to murder the first Christian he sees seems to be more of just a way for them to create an antagonistic situation for the film, rather than anything that we would say represents real, even medieval Christian attitudes towards what had been pagan. The next interesting thing occurs just a little bit after, once Leif Erikson escapes. Wow, that quality looks horrible. This is Leif Erikson. This is one of his servants who does not have a name, and they're in a physical fight over a crucifix that had been hanging on the ship. And there's this idea of the pagan mutiny, which happens almost as soon as they leave Eric the Red's place, and his crew decides that they would never sail under a Christian captain. So this guy springs up out of nowhere, snatches the crucifix off the ship. Leif Erikson tries to stop him. He can't, and the dude throws the crucifix into the water. And he announces, "I've thrown your God into the sea. Now we must turn back." Leif Erikson says, "Nah, we don't." And they kept going. Nothing else came of the mutiny. But is there a basis in any of our source material for a pagan-led mutiny against Christian captains? The answer is no, there's not. The one incidence of an attempted mutiny that I could find in the saga corpus was in Gretti's saga, when he's sailing to Norway. I think he's like 15 years old, and he's just bullying everyone on the boat. And so the crew says they're not going to do any more work anymore unless the captain gets rid of him. And so he has to make a deal with the captain. There was no mutiny, and it had nothing to do with anyone being Christian or pagan. So yeah, just another way for the director and the writer to create this image of the disobedient, intolerant pagan who didn't want to cooperate with the Christian captain. And there was also another incident somewhat related to this, where Leif Erikson starts to show favor to his slave Alwyn, who was a Christian because he was English. And his other slaves start whispering Leif Erikson has a Christian slave, this is horrible. Which, of course, also has no historical basis, because the Viking slaves were multi-ethnic, multi-religious. They were coming from Ireland, they were coming from Russia. They would have spoken any number of languages, practiced all kinds of religions, and we can even see Christians being sold at Viking slave markets in the 9th century. So there's no substantial basis for this idea of slaves being intolerant of the religion of other slaves. But that's the image presented in this film, that we have the mutiny, the general complete intolerance towards being in the presence of Christianity. And the next element of pagan faith that we're presented with is the idea of this belief in witches and ghosts. And you can see here one of the lines of dialogue. "Black night upon a waste of waters, with age-old fears creeping back into pagan hearts." Basically what happens is Helga Nilsson was supposed to have stayed behind in Greenland, but she stowed away on Leif Erikson's boat, and she's been eating food. And the crew members notice the food is missing, and they say it must be witches or ghosts. So was this pagan obsession with the supernatural reflective of what we think we know about them? In this case, yes. We have a pretty broad literary tradition of interactions with the undead that occurs in saga literature. We've got the mound dwellers, we've got the draugr, whether it could be translated as ghost. I mean, the Draugr have physical forms, but they can also pass through walls and stuff. So I've read translations where it's translated as ghost, so I'll give him a pass on that one. Witchcraft also plays a role in several sagas, including if we go back to Grettir's saga, he was killed by a witch, more or less, who cursed him at the very end so that he would die. And then she was executed for practicing witchcraft. So yes, it does seem that that the Icelanders of this time period would have feared supernatural events like this. So yeah, I mean, not the worst presentation of paganism in the film by far. So let's look at the weirdest, I think. So the other conflict of the film is the love square that happens between Helga, Alwyn, Leif Erikson, and his steersman, who's unimportant except for one scene where he starts a fight over the woman. Leif Erikson falls in love with her, says they're going to get married on the boat. I guess he can do it because he's the captain. So out of nowhere, a wedding is about to appear, and Leif Erikson announces that I'm going to marry you according to the ancient Viking custom. What is the ancient Viking custom and why is a Christian participating in it remains mostly unanswered. There seems to be a connection to the moon because he says the wedding will take place after the second passage of the moon. I was not able to find any mention anywhere of a pagan Viking marriage custom connected to the moon. And so we have to ask ourselves, first of all, was there a connection between ancient Viking pagan religion and marriage? And the answer is not so clear-cut. I think that Hilbert said it best in the introduction when he said that basically a decentralized religion existing in a chieftain level or a very early state level society wouldn't have made the distinction between religion and the supernatural and their daily life. So if the pagans had marriage, then it would have been connected to their religion as we understand it. So what do we know about that marriage? Basically nothing. The modern scholarship seems to agree, more or less, that weddings were connected to the idea of sacrifice. And that claim is specifically made by Gro Steinsland in her 2005 book on Norse religion, that sacrifices were made to the pagan gods at weddings. No sacrifice appears in this marriage. No mention of any gods appears. It seems to have nothing to do with anything that we know about actual ancient Viking weddings. She's wearing a white dress. There's a guy standing there holding up a cup of something to drink. And actually, we don't even see the wedding completed because she won't go through with it, and it's not interesting. So basically, the Viking presents paganism as a violent, intolerant, superstitious religion that, aside from these negative characteristics, superficially resembles the Christianity of its time. People basically do the same things. They bow down in front of the priest or the statue. They accept a gift from the king or the chieftain, and they try to stop other people from switching to the opposite side. This is basically the only things that we see in this movie. Some aspects of the portrayal, like the superstitious belief, do have a basis in historical sources, but the overall portrait is incredibly inaccurate. It seems to be a Hollywood creation. Surprise. As if we couldn't figure that out from the costume design. One of the contemporary critics of the film said that the costume design and the characters appear to have stepped off of the opera stage, including one scene where it's a close-up of Eric the Red's face, and he's very clearly wearing blue eyeshadow, like in giant circles around his eyes, and his skin is like painted white. But, you know, the entire movie is on YouTube, so if anybody out there is seriously interested in watching it, which I honestly can't recommend, that it's there. You won't like it. And as a last bonus, I know this isn't at all related to paganism in any way, but if anybody cares about the archaeological basis for the depiction of crucifixes in the film, we have in the very center Olaf Tryggvason's crucifix that he gifts to Leif Erikson, along with a message to spread the good word in Greenland. And then it's compared side by side with two Scandinavian archaeological finds dated to the Viking Age. We have this silver one from Birka in Sweden, and this gold one was actually unearthed in Denmark in 2019. So they get a pass for not referencing that one. But this one is a 19th century find, so. Yep. So that's a little bit about the paganism and how it's presented in Roy William Neal's The Viking. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, are there any questions apart from please send me the link because I really want to watch this straight away?
Yeah, I was wondering, did you find, did you figure out if this was kind of like an isolated depiction, or if there is, and this is kind of like part of a general trend towards this period? If is this asymptomatic of the period's depiction of Vikings, or is it part of it, like a general perspective?
More specifically, I did not look at anything other than this film in terms of 20th century material. More generally, a lot of the depictions of violence in the movie were actually regulated by film law codes in the early 20th century that governed how you could portray violence. And so that plays into the reasons why the good characters don't exercise violence except in one scene in self-defense, because at that time it was actually illegal for good people to just commit violence for its own sake in film. So to some extent you could justify some of the changes because they were incapable of legally creating an accurate movie of the sagas, but I don't know how that would apply to the pattern of pagan representation outside of this movie.
If there are no others, I want to ask, why?
Why watch it?
Well, no, like, why did you watch it? And then we were like, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to fly to Oslo. I'm going to give a presentation as the keynote speaker, of course.
I did not seek that designation. Well, I was really just curious because it was so old, like relative to like the Viking series or the Northman or anything that's come out in the 21st century. And I haven't really watched many movies from the 20s, so I was interested to see how they would have interpreted the material in that time period.
Fair enough. All right, are there any more? I think that pretty much we've done many hours. So like everyone who's still here, like congratulations, it's very impressive, all of you. That was awesome, Jonathan.
Thank you
very much for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess one more on the course.